In 1843, in the opulent, sun-scorched humidity of Natchez, Mississippi, 7 daughters of the plantation elite vanished. One by one they were erased, not by force, but by a whisper. The families, the wealthiest cotton barons on the river, presented a unified, sterile story. Their daughters were merely away, sent to finishing schools in Europe, married off to distant cousins in Charleston, recovering from a low fever in the cooler air of the north. But there were no letters home. No carriages returned. No bodies were ever found, and no investigations were ever completed. In the stifling drawing rooms of Natchez, where reputation was the only currency that mattered, these questions were not just impolite, they were dangerous. But in the forgotten archives of Adams County, tucked away in a trunk marked Household Ledgers, there exists a diary. Its leather is warped by damp, its ink faded to rust. And it does not speak of finishing schools. It tells a different story. A story of a treatment so methodical, so psychologically brutal, that it was considered a miracle cure for imperfection. This is the account of what really happened in the East Barn of the Kellerman estate. The story of why Catherine Kellerman, the wealthiest and most imperfect of them all, was given to 6 enslaved men, and why her body was the one they never found. To understand the Kellerman estate, you must first understand Natchez. In 1843, the city was a monument to 2 things: unimaginable wealth and the absolute denial of the human cost required to build it. It was a kingdom built on cotton, a society floating on a sea of white gold, harvested by nearly 250,000 enslaved hands. Along the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi, mansions rose like pale, arrogant temples. Greek columns, manicured gardens, imported furniture. Every brick was a statement of superiority. But beneath the polished surfaces, this society was rotting. It was a closed system, ruled by a handful of families who competed in everything, not just cotton yields, but the perfection of their bloodlines, the piety of their wives, and the flawless, porcelain quality of their daughters. Appearance was not part of life. It was life, and any flaw, any crack in that perfect facade was not just an embarrassment. It was a threat to the entire system, a stain to be scrubbed out, quietly and permanently. This was the world Lucinda Kellerman didn't just inhabit, it was a world she had mastered. She was the high priestess of this conspiracy of silence, the arbiter of who belonged and who would be erased. And her greatest, most public failure was her own daughter, Lucinda Kellerman. Even the name commanded respect. At 42, she was the mistress of the Kellerman estate, nearly 4,000 acres of prime cotton land. She had inherited it from her father, a rare and scrutinized position of power for a woman. She had compensated for this impropriety by becoming more rigid, more demanding, and more obsessed with control than any man in the county. Her dinner parties were legendary, whispered about for their terrifying exactitude. The silver had to gleam at a precise angle. The flowers had to be arranged in the French style. Her own body was a testament to her will, cinched by tight corseting, starved on vinegar water, perpetually breathless but undeniably, painfully fashionable. She was a woman who saw the world as a thing to be organized, managed, and corrected. And she wielded her power absolutely. She controlled her house, her fields, and the 237 souls she owned. But there was one thing she could not control. One living, breathing humiliation that met her gaze across the dinner table every night. Her daughter, Catherine. A girl who, in Lucinda's cold, assessing eyes, was a deliberate, grotesque act of rebellion. A stain that would not be ignored. Catherine Kellerman, at 19, was everything her mother despised. Where Lucinda was angular and sharp as glass, Catherine was soft. By the brutal standards of 1843, she was considered grotesquely obese. Her body refused to conform to the willowy, fragile ideal that Lucinda worshipped as God. But this wasn't just about weight. To Lucinda, it was a moral failing, a public display of indulgence, a weakness. "She eats like a field hand," Lucinda would hiss to her confidants, her voice a blade of pure disgust. "I have given her every advantage, and she repays me with this display." What Lucinda never, ever mentioned, what she perhaps could not even admit to herself, was when Catherine's transformation had begun. It started in 1839, the year her father, Thomas Kellerman, died. The official cause was listed as heart failure. But the whispers, the ones known only to the house servants who cleaned the study, told a different story. An empty bottle of laudanum, A letter to Catherine clutched in his cold hand. A letter that Lucinda, finding him first, had immediately and calmly fed to the fireplace, before anyone else could read it. Before the world could know the truth, Catherine's grief, with no outlet and no comfort, had turned inward, and she had built a fortress of flesh to protect herself from the woman who had burned her father's last words. The Kellerman plantation ran on the brutal efficiency Lucinda demanded in all things. Among the 237 enslaved people working the fields, the house, and the outbuildings, there were 6 men who would become central to Catherine's fate. The title of this story, The One Whispered in Secret, says she was given to them, and she was. But not in the way you think. Or perhaps, in exactly the way you fear. The first was Joshua Fletcher, 34 years old, born on this land, trained as the plantation's blacksmith. His hands were scarred from the hammer and the forge, and he possessed a strength that made him valuable. He spoke little, but his eyes missed nothing. He kept a mental catalog of every cruelty he witnessed, storing them away like embers, waiting for air. The second, Samuel Hayes, 28, literate. He'd been purchased at a Natchez auction after his previous owner, a merchant, went bankrupt. Lucinda used his dangerous, rare skill to manage the plantation's ledgers, always under her direct, suffocating supervision. Samuel understood numbers, but more than that, he understood patterns. The third was Daniel Cooper, just 16, purchased from a failing sugar plantation in Louisiana. He had seen horrors that left him with a stutter and a flinch at any sudden sound. But that trauma had made him observant, almost invisible, noticing details that others, in their confidence, overlooked. The last 3 were Elias, Marcus, and Silas. Elias was the oldest, a man who carried a quiet, spiritual gravity. Marcus was the rebel, young and hot-blooded, his hatred for their owners simmering just beneath the skin. And Silas? Silas was the broken one, muted by a past trauma, who rarely spoke at all. They were a unit. They trusted each other, and they were about to be trapped in an impossible situation. The stage for this treatment was the old East Barn. It stood at the edge of the property, isolated from the main house by a dense grove of live oaks, heavy with Spanish moss. It was invisible from the mansion's pristine windows. It had once been used to store cotton bales, but a new warehouse closer to the river had been built years ago. By 1843, the East Barn was relegated to grain storage, broken equipment, and secrets. It was a place of shadows and silence, the perfect location for activities that required discretion, the perfect laboratory for Lucinda Kellerman's experiment. She was not a monster of impulse. She was a monster of meticulous planning, and her plan, the one that would ripple out to destroy 7 other families, began with a simple afternoon tea. It was a visit to the neighboring Ashworth estate. It was there she observed the miracle of Margaret Ashworth, a girl who, just 6 months prior, had been as unmarriageable and plump as Catherine. Now Margaret was a vision, delicate, thin, and utterly silent. Her eyes were vacant. Her hands shook. But she fit the dress, and in Natchez that was all that mattered. Lucinda's diary, the one found decades later, reveals the exact moment her plan crystallized. The entry is dated March 15, 1843. It reads, "Today I observed the Ashworth girl. A miraculous change. Mrs. Ashworth confided the method. Labor. Constant, unrelenting physical labor. The body, when pushed beyond its limits, consumes itself. It burns away the excess, revealing the form that God intended." You can almost feel the chill of Lucinda's excitement in the ink, the clinical predatory focus. Why should this remedy be available only to the Ashworths? Why should my own daughter remain a monument to gluttony when salvation is so simple? I have the means. I have the place. I have the workers who will obey without question. Catherine's transformation begins tomorrow. But here is the secret you're not supposed to know. The part Lucinda omitted. Mrs. Ashworth's method wasn't just labor. It was starvation. It was isolation, and it was proximity. The Ashworth girl had been quartered in a tobacco barn, with 4 field hands who were given absolute authority over her. The girl hadn't just been worked thin. She had been broken, psychologically, fundamentally. Her vacant eyes, her constant tremor. It wasn't from fatigue. It was from terror, and that was the part of the cure Lucinda truly coveted. The breaking, because a broken thing is easy to control. On March 16, 1843, Lucinda summoned the 6 men to the main house. Joshua, Samuel, Daniel, Elias, Marcus, Silas. It was unheard of. Field hands did not enter the parlor. They stood awkwardly on the fine carpets, smelling of sweat and iron, acutely aware that their very presence was a violation of the sacred boundaries that kept the plantation running. Lucinda Kellerman did not ask them to sit. She circled them, her silk dress rustling. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice dripping with the false warmth she used when giving an order she expected to be obeyed. "Or else, I have a special task for you. A project of rehabilitation." She described Catherine, not as her daughter, but as a failed project. "My daughter has become weak and indolent, unsuited for her duties. She requires physical correction." Joshua felt the air grow cold. "You mean labor, mistress?" Lucinda smiled, a thin, bloodless line. "Labor is the tool, Mr. Fletcher. The goal is compliance. You six will oversee her daily work in the east barn. From dawn until dusk, you will ensure she completes her tasks. You will document her progress." She handed Samuel a new ledger. "And you will speak of this to no one." The threat hung in the air, thick and unspoken. Disobedience meant the whip. It meant the auction block. It meant being sold downriver to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, a fate worse than death. But there was something else in her eyes. An anticipation, an excitement, a clinical cold curiosity. She wasn't just assigning a task. She was setting a trap. The 6 men were trapped. They understood the mechanics of slavery. They knew that an order was an order. But this was different. This was not a command to pick cotton or forge iron. It was a command to break a white woman, the daughter of their owner. They were being placed in an impossible position. As they walked from the main house to their quarters, the weight of it settled on them. "This is a trick," Marcus spat, kicking at the dust. "She wants an excuse. She wants us to put our hands on her so she can have us strung up." Elias the elder shook his head. "No, it's worse. She wants us to do it. She wants us to be the whip. She wants to use us as the weapon." Samuel the reader was silent. He understood the subtext. Lucinda was washing her hands. If Catherine broke, Lucinda's treatment was a success. If Catherine didn't survive, if she died from the labor, who would be blamed? The daughter for her weakness? Or the 6 enslaved men who were the only witnesses? They would be hanged to silence them. It was a perfect closed loop of cruelty. They were being handed a young woman and a death sentence. Theirs or hers. "What do we do?" whispered Daniel, the 16-year-old, his voice shaking. Joshua stopped. He looked at the east barn, dark against the setting sun. "Tomorrow. We do exactly what she said. We work and we watch. We watch her. And we watch each other. We survive. That is all." Catherine herself was not consulted. She was not informed. On the morning of March 17th, she was simply taken. Her mother's personal maid, a woman with eyes as cold as Lucinda's, led her from her bedroom. She was still in her nightdress, a simple, rough work dress shoved over it. Her face showed no surprise, only a deep, exhausted resignation. This was just the newest, most elaborate in a long line of humiliations her mother had devised. The walk to the barn was silent. The air was cool and damp. Catherine looked at the grove of live oaks, a place she had played as a child, now feeling like the path to an execution. The 6 men were waiting inside. The massive barn doors creaked open and the maid shoved her forward.
"Mrs. Kellerman's instructions are clear," the maid said to Joshua.
"She is to be corrected. Do not fail." Then the doors slid shut with a sound of utter finality. A heavy wooden bar dropped into place from the outside. Catherine was locked in. She turned, her heart hammering. The barn was vast, filled with shadows and the smell of old hay and rust. And the 6 men, just watching her. Some with pity, some with anger, some with a terrifying blankness. She was alone, in an isolated building with 6 men who had been given absolute power over her. She finally understood. This wasn't about exercise. This wasn't about her weight. This was a punishment. This was terror. The first morning began with a mechanical, brutal efficiency. Lucinda had planned every detail of Catherine's degradation. The tasks were laid out. She was to use the manual stone mill to grind corn. She was to carry 50-pound sacks of grain from one end of the vast barn to the other, and then back again. She was to split firewood until a quota was met. This wasn't productive work. It was pointless. It was Sisyphus in a Mississippi barn. It was designed for one thing, and one thing only: exhaustion. To push her body past its limits until it simply gave out. The barn amplified every sound. The scrape of the stone mill. Catherine's ragged, desperate breathing. The thud of the grain sacks hitting the dusty floor. The men watched. They were silent. They were actors in a play they never auditioned for. "Lift it," Joshua said, his voice flat, trying to find the tone of an overseer. "Mistress says you lift it." Catherine's hands, soft and unused to anything but needlework, were raw and blistering within the first hour. She stumbled, falling to her knees. Marcus stepped forward, his face a mask of rage. "Get up!" Catherine flinched, expecting a blow, but it didn't come. Daniel, the young boy, quickly looked away, unable to watch. Samuel just made a mark in the ledger. They were performing. Performing for the audience of one who wasn't even there. Performing for the fear of what would happen if they didn't. At precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they heard the bar lift on the outside of the door. The massive door slid open, flooding the barn with blinding hot sunlight. Lucinda Kellerman stood silhouetted against the light, her form rail-thin and severe. She entered, her skirts rustling over the dirt floor. She circled her daughter like a buyer inspecting livestock. Catherine was covered in sweat, dirt, and blood from her hands. She was trembling from exhaustion, barely able to stand. Lucinda carried her leather journal. She made a note. "Hands developing calluses," she said, her voice clinical, as if noting a change in the weather. "Unfortunate, but necessary." She looked at Catherine's face, still defiant, still aware. Then she looked at Joshua, her eyes narrowing. "She is tired. But she is not corrected. The work is not having the desired effect. Perhaps your methods are too gentle." The threat was clear. "The treatment progresses, mistress," Samuel said quickly, stepping forward with the ledger. "We are documenting her resistance." Lucinda's gaze snapped to him. "See that you do. See that you overcome it." She turned to leave. "Tomorrow," she said, "you will double the quota, and you will restrict her water. I expect results." The door shut. The bar fell. Catherine collapsed onto the dirt floor, sobbing, and the 6 men were left in the darkness, their impossible task just having been made deadly. That night the barn was a tinderbox of fear and rage. Catherine slept an exhausted, dreamless sleep in a pile of clean hay, but the 6 men gathered at the far end, their voices hushed and desperate. "Double the quota. Restrict the water?" Marcus hissed. "She's trying to kill her, and she's making us do it." Silas, the mute one, rocked back and forth, his agitation a clear sign of the horror he was reliving. "He's right," Samuel said, his face grim. "She's testing us. She wants to see how far we will go. If we don't push the girl harder, we will be punished. If we do, we become that." He didn't have to say the word. Murderers. "What choice do we have?" Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "It's us or her. It's her." Joshua Fletcher looked at the boy and then at the sleeping form of Catherine. He thought of his own wife, his own children, sleeping in the quarters. He thought of the absolute godlike power Lucinda wielded. "No," he said, his voice quiet but final. "It's not us or her. It's us and her, against Lucinda. We're all in this barn. We're all her prisoners." There was a long silence. Elias nodded slowly. "The boy is right. We have no choice. But the blacksmith is also right. We have a chance. What if we pretend?" The plan formed in whispers. It was born of desperation and a sliver of hope. They couldn't refuse the order. But they wouldn't obey it either. They would perform. They would become actors. Starting tomorrow, they would be the cruelest overseers Lucinda could imagine. There would be shouting. There would be threats. Marcus, with his simmering anger, would be the bad one. Joshua would be the cold, demanding leader. Samuel would meticulously document a fictional account of Catherine's resistance and correction. They would double the noise of the work, but not the work itself. When Catherine split wood, Joshua would stand over her shouting, while Elias or Daniel secretly finished the quota. When she carried the sacks, they would fill them only halfway, but make her groan and strain as if they were full. They would give her water in secret from a cistern they knew of at the back of the barn, while presenting an empty cup to Lucinda. They would become her secret protectors. They would shield her. They would hide her. They would lie. It was an insane risk. If Lucinda discovered the deception, they would all be killed. Slowly. But it was the only path that allowed them to live with themselves. It was the only way to hold on to the last shreds of their own humanity. What struck Samuel most in those first days was Catherine's silence. She did not complain. She did not plead. She did not even speak except to ask for water, which, at first, they were instructed to provide sparingly. Her face remained a mask of pure blank resignation. She worked as if she had already removed herself from her body, as if she were watching this all happen from a great, great distance. But after the men made their pact, the dynamic in the barn shifted. It became surreal. Marcus would scream at her, his voice echoing off the rafters, "You will do it, or I will make you." And in the same motion, kick a log closer so she wouldn't have to reach. Joshua would bark, "Faster! Mistress wants this done," while his eyes darted to the barn door, listening for the sound of Lucinda's approach. When Catherine stumbled, her hands bloody from the rough wood, Samuel would roughly grab her arm, only to press a clean rag and a hidden smear of antiseptic balm into her palm. Catherine was confused. The cruelty was there, the words, the threats, but the blows never landed. The starvation never fully took hold. She began to see the performance. She saw the way Daniel would flinch when Marcus shouted, not at her, but for her. She saw the terror in their eyes, and she realized they were just as afraid as she was. The first time Catherine spoke, beyond asking for water, was on April 8th, 6 weeks into her confinement. She was resting during the brief noon break. Joshua was repairing a piece of equipment nearby, his back to her. "Do you hate me?" she asked, her voice quiet. Joshua's hands stilled on the tools. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. Direct eye contact was a death sentence. "No, miss," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "You should," Catherine whispered. I am everything you should hate. The daughter of the woman who owns you. Living in comfort while, she couldn't finish. "Hate takes energy, Miss Catherine," Joshua said, his words careful, measured. Energy better spent on surviving. That one word, surviving. It broke something open. "She wants me to disappear," Catherine said, the words tumbling out. "She wants the daughter she imagined, not me. I think she hoped this work would kill me, so she could tell people I died of a wasting disease and finally be rid of her embarrassment." Samuel, who had been pretending to organize grain sacks, felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He looked at Joshua. They had all suspected it, but hearing her say it, hearing her confirm the true purpose of this treatment, changed everything. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. Lucinda's diary entries from this period grew darker. Her clinical observations gave way to frustration, and then to a cold, chilling calculation. June 3, 1843, Catherine persists. Her corpulence remains, despite the rigors. Weight reduction is minimal. Perhaps the rations must be restricted further. Perhaps the work must extend into the night. But what she didn't know was why Catherine persisted. Joshua and the others had been supplementing her meager rations. Food smuggled from the quarters. A piece of cornbread here, a stolen apple there, not much. Just enough to keep her from the dangerous malnutrition that was, according to rumor, making the other girls sick. Lucinda wasn't just experimenting on Catherine. She was consulting. Her diary entries gloated about her private conversations with other plantation ladies who also had problematic daughters. Mrs. Helena Cartwright, whose daughter Rebecca was caught reading abolitionist literature. Mrs. Beatrice Singleton, whose daughter Emma refused 3 suitable marriage proposals. Mrs. Constance Whitfield, whose daughter Sarah was discovered teaching enslaved children to read. These women would visit the Kellerman estate for tea, but they always asked to see the barn. Lucinda always obliged. "You see," Lucinda would say, gesturing to Catherine's artificially exhausted form, her voice full of a scientist's pride. "The body responds to discipline, just as the spirit does. 3 weeks of proper labor, and already the excess begins to melt away." The visitors took notes. They asked questions about methods, duration, supervision, dietary restrictions. "No leisure," Lucinda confirmed. "Leisure is what created this problem. Idleness and indulgence are sisters." By April, the first of the other girls arrived. Not at the Kellerman estate, but at their own. Rebecca Cartwright was delivered to a tobacco barn on her family's property, overseen by 3 field hands who had been given the same instructions. Emma Singleton followed 2 weeks later, then Sarah Whitfield. Each family modified the treatment, but the core remained. Isolation, labor, and the breaking of will, all disguised as physical improvement. What none of these mothers anticipated was that the enslaved workers on these different plantations talked. And Daniel, the 16-year-old, was the one who pieced it together. He was sometimes sent to deliver grain to neighboring estates, and he began to notice a pattern. There are others, Daniel whispered to Samuel one evening, his voice trembling as they secured the barn for the night. I seen 'em, girls, working just like Miss Catherine. In the barns, looking just as tired, just as scared. He described the Singleton barn, which had been empty for years, now having guards posted at the door. He told them about the Cartwright place, how he'd heard a woman crying, but everyone pretended it was just the wind. Samuel felt something cold settle in his gut. This wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. This was a system. This was a network. A conspiracy of mothers, all using Lucinda's cure to fix their inconvenient daughters. He had to know more. Using his privileged position as a record keeper, Samuel began to risk everything. Late at night, when he was supposed to be balancing the grain ledgers in the main house, he started looking elsewhere. He looked in Lucinda's unlocked desk. He looked at her correspondence. And he found it. A different ledger. Not for cotton, not for grain. A private one, hidden in it, were names. Margaret Ashworth. And 4 other girls. Girls who had been treated before Catherine. And next to each name was a final entry, disposed of. Natural causes, or transferred to family in Texas. Or, most chilling of all, just one word, resolved. What does resolved mean? Daniel asked, his stutter thick with fear, when Samuel showed him the entries late one night in the barn. Samuel's face was grim. It means they didn't recover. It means they didn't transform. It means they were resolved in the same way you resolve a sick animal. The blood drained from Catherine's face. Margaret Ashworth, the girl whose miraculous change had inspired all of this. She was listed as resolved. She wasn't delicate and thin. She was dead. This entire system. It wasn't a cure. It was a disposal. An execution engine for inconvenient women. Catherine was in more danger than she knew, even with the 6 of them protecting her. If her mother decided she had failed the treatment, she would simply be resolved. We have to act, Joshua said, his voice a low growl. We cannot just wait for her to decide. But how? They were prisoners. They had no money, no power. No one would believe them. It was Catherine who spoke. My father's study, she whispered, her mind racing. Before he died. He kept money hidden there, papers, documents about the plantation. My mother, she never goes in that room. She had it locked after his death, but I know where she keeps the key. The plan they devised was born of pure, undiluted desperation. It had 1,000 ways to fail. Catherine would have to feign an illness so severe, so sudden, that she would be taken back to the main house. Not just to her room, but she would have to convince them she needed confinement. During that time, she would have to get to her mother's bedroom, retrieve the key, access her father's locked study, find the money and any documents, and then return to her room, all without being seen. The house was not empty. It was teeming with house servants, all of whom were Lucinda's eyes and ears. The key, Catherine explained, her voice shaking. It's in her music box. The one my grandmother gave her. She keeps it on her dressing table. The men stared at her. Get into her bedroom? To the dressing table? Marcus said, it's impossible. Her personal maid. She sleeps on a cot in the room. Not always, Catherine said. On Tuesdays. Tuesday night, my mother hosts her card game. It goes late. Her maid. She stays downstairs to serve them. It's the only time. This was Monday. They had one day for Catherine to get sick enough to be moved. One day to plan a heist that could either free them or get them all killed. The next morning, Catherine began her performance. She collapsed while carrying a grain sack, one of the half-empty ones. She cried out, clutching her abdomen, her performance so convincing that even Joshua felt a moment of real panic. When Lucinda arrived for her 3 p.m. inspection, she found her daughter pale, sweating, and curled in a ball on the dirt floor, groaning. She refuses to work, mistress, Joshua said, playing his part. She claims she is in pain. Lucinda stared down at Catherine with pure, unadulterated disgust. malingering. It's just another weakness. But Catherine's cries were sharp, and Lucinda could not risk her subject dying of something as common as appendicitis before the treatment was complete. "Fine," she snapped. "Take her to the house. Lock her in her room. If she is faking, she will return tomorrow for double labor. If she is genuinely ill, I will send for Dr. Harrison in the morning." The ticking clock had started. The mention of Dr. Harrison, the same man who had likely signed Margaret Ashworth's false death certificate, terrified Catherine. She had until dawn, until the doctor arrived and exposed her as a healthy, terrified fraud. She had just a few hours, while her mother played cards, to find the key to her freedom. That night the mansion was alive with the sound of the card party downstairs. Laughter, the clinking of glasses. Catherine waited in her locked room, her heart hammering a rhythm against her ribs. She listened to the patterns of the house, patterns she had unconsciously memorized her entire life. 10 o'clock. The party was loud. 11 o'clock. She heard the servants moving in the halls, but not her mother's personal maid. This was it. She picked the simple lock on her bedroom door with a hairpin, a skill she'd learned as a rebellious child. She slipped into the hallway, a ghost in her own home. The hall was dark, lit only by a single candle. Her mother's bedroom door was unlocked. She pushed it open. The room was dark, but the moonlight streamed in, illuminating the dressing table. And on it, the music box. Her hands shook as she opened it. The tinkling, delicate melody seemed to scream in the silent house. She winced, grabbing the small cold iron key from inside, cutting the music short. She fled the room down the hall to the one place she hadn't been in 4 years. Her father's study. The lock turned. The door creaked open. The study smelled of old leather, tobacco, and grief. Scents that brought back a wave of memories so powerful Catherine had to lean against the doorframe. Memories of a time before her father's heart failure, before her mother's cruelty found its full, horrific expression. She allowed herself 1 second of grief. Then she focused. The desk. Her father had shown her the false bottom years ago, a secret game between them. It was still there. Inside was money. 300 in various bills. A fortune. Enough to buy passage north. Enough for a new start. But it was the documents beneath the money, that stopped her breath. Letters. Dozens of them. Letters from her father to a lawyer in Philadelphia, detailing his plans to free every enslaved person on the Kellerman plantation. Letters describing his growing moral horror at the institution of slavery. And one final, unsealed letter, addressed to her. "My dearest Catherine, if you are reading this, I have failed. Your mother will say it was my heart, and in a sense it was. It failed to be brave enough. I cannot free those I have enslaved while I live. Your mother will stop me. Forgive me for my cowardice. Forgive me for leaving you alone." He had taken his own life, overwhelmed by guilt, and Lucinda had hidden it. But there was more. One last document, her father's actual will, never probated. In it, he left the entire Kellerman estate, not to Lucinda, but to Catherine, with the explicit instruction that all enslaved persons were to be manumitted upon his death. Lucinda had hidden it. She had forged his signature. She had stolen the plantation. This was not just leverage. This was a bomb. Catherine returned to her room just as the sky began to turn a faint, sickly gray. She hid the money and the explosive documents in the lining of a heavy winter coat, a coat she knew her mother, obsessed with seasons, would never look at in the middle of summer. She locked her door from the inside and climbed into bed, her mind racing. She was not the weak, soft girl who had entered the barn. She was the rightful owner of this entire estate. She was the holder of a truth that could destroy her mother. When the maid arrived with Dr. Harrison, Catherine was recovered, miraculously. She declared herself ready to return to her treatment. Lucinda was suspicious, furious at the malingering, but she was also relieved. Her experiment could continue. "You will return to the barn," Lucinda commanded. "And Dr. Harrison will visit you there this afternoon to assess your condition and ensure this deception does not happen again." The doctor's visit. In the barn, he would examine her. He would see she was not sick. He would see she was perfectly healthy and being fed. The men's deception would be exposed. They would all be killed. They had, perhaps, 6 hours. 6 hours to run. When Catherine returned to the barn and revealed what she had found, the air crackled. She laid the will, the letters and the money on the dirt floor. The 6 men stared. She doesn't even own this place, Daniel whispered, his stutter gone, replaced by awe. You own it, Miss Catherine. You own us. And you are free, Catherine said, her voice shaking with the power of it. Or you will be, if we can get this will to a judge. Samuel shook his head, his practicality cutting through the hope. No judge in Mississippi will honor this, not with Lucinda Kellerman standing there. They will declare you incompetent, and they will burn this paper. We cannot fight her here. Then we leave, Joshua said. Tonight, all of us. We take the money, the documents, and we run. We run north, to Philadelphia. To your father's lawyers. 7 of us, Elias said, his voice heavy. A white woman traveling with 6 men. We won't make it 5 miles. Every slave patrol in the state will be on us before dawn. He's right, Marcus spat. It's a suicide mission. They argued, their voices rising until Catherine held up her hand. Not all of us, she said, her voice breaking. You're right. We won't make it as a group, but a widow, a grieving widow, traveling with her property to settle her late husband's debts. That they would believe. The new plan was even more dangerous. Catherine would travel as Mrs. Kellerman, a widow. The $300 would pay for passage. But she couldn't travel with 6 men. It was too conspicuous, too much value for a single woman. 3, Samuel said, his mind working quickly. A widow might travel with 3. A driver, a valet, a laborer, Joshua, Daniel, and myself. I can read the maps. I can handle the transactions. What? What about us? Marcus demanded, his hand moving to the knife he kept hidden. You just leave us here? No, Joshua said. You 3, Elias, Marcus, Silas, you will be the diversion. You will be the reason they don't look for us. The plan was horrific. An hour after Catherine and the others left, the 3 remaining men would set a fire, not the main house, but the cotton. The new warehouse by the river, the profit. The entire plantation would be focused on the fire. It would be chaos. In that chaos, they would run. Not north, south, west, any direction but the one the others were taking. It might work, Elias said softly. It will buy you time. It's a sacrifice, Catherine whispered, her eyes filling with tears. They will hunt you. We are already hunted, Marcus said, his voice flat. This is just running on our own terms. The first part of the plan was Samuel. He would have to go to Natchez, now, in broad daylight. He had permission to be in town for plantation business. He had to find a forger. A free black man known only as Crawford, who operated out of a warehouse near the river. Samuel would take $50 of the precious money. He had to purchase false travel papers, a bill of sale, a letter of transit, all identifying Catherine as a widow and Joshua, Daniel, and himself as her legal property. It was the most dangerous part. If he was caught with that much money, if he was caught speaking to Crawford, he would be hanged before sunset. No trial, no questions. Go, Joshua said, gripping his shoulder. Be invisible, Samuel nodded. He pulled his hat low, adopted the shuffling, downcast posture expected of him, and walked out of the barn, disappearing into the blinding sunlight, holding the fate of all 7 of them in his pocket. The hours in the barn were an agony. Every sound from outside, every footstep. Was it Lucinda? Was it the overseer? Was it the sound of Samuel? Being caught? If you've come this far with us, into the darkness of this barn, comment the truth bleeds through below. Because you're not just watching a story. You're becoming a witness. You're becoming part of the truth that was supposed to be erased. And the most terrifying part is yet to come. The 6 of them, Catherine, Joshua, Daniel, Elias, Marcus, and Silas. They sat in the oppressive, humid silence, waiting. They didn't talk. What was there to say? They were balanced on the blade of a knife. The entire future, their lives, their freedom, depended on a man who was, at that very moment, walking through a city that considered him less than human, trying to buy a lie from another man who would be killed for selling it. This is the part of history they don't put in the books. The quiet, agonizing moments of terror, the choices that have no good options, the horrifying silent gamble for a life that should have been theirs by right. Catherine looked at the 5 men who had saved her, who had shielded her at the risk of their own lives, and she knew she would never, ever be the person she was before. Samuel returned just as the sun began to dip, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. He didn't smile. He just nodded. He slipped into the barn and handed Catherine a packet of documents. His hands were shaking. "Crawford. He sends his regards," Samuel whispered, his voice hoarse. "Travel papers. For Mrs. Catherine Kellerman, widow, traveling with 3 servants, to Louisville, Kentucky, to settle her late husband's estate." The forgery was perfect, official-looking seals. Signatures that looked authentic. The irony was acidic. To be free, they had to pretend to be property. The system that enslaved them would be the very tool of their escape. "We leave in 2 hours," Catherine said, her voice low and firm. "As soon as the sun is fully down. We walk to Natchez. We stay off the main road. We get to the riverfront. The Morning Star. It's a steamboat. It leaves for Louisville at dawn. We will be on it. Then the goodbyes." The part that felt like tearing. Catherine turned to Elias, Marcus, and Silas. There was no time for speeches. She took Elias's hands. "Thank you." He just nodded, his eyes kind. She looked at Marcus. "Be safe." He just grunted, "You too." She hugged Silas, the man who never spoke. He just held on for a second, too long. Then Joshua, Samuel, and Daniel embraced their brothers. A hard, desperate, final embrace. "Set that fire," Joshua said to Marcus. "Make it burn." "Oh," Marcus said, a terrible smile touching his lips. "It'll burn." The walk to Natchez was 4 hours of pure condensed terror. They moved through the darkness, following paths Samuel knew, paths that cut through swamps and fields, avoiding the main roads and the patrols. Every rustle in the woods. Was it a patrol? Every dog bark? Was it an alarm? Catherine, unaccustomed to the terrain, struggled. Her city shoes were destroyed in the first mile. But she never complained. She just kept moving. Joshua and Daniel practically carried her at points. They reached the outskirts of Natchez just as the sky was turning from black to a deep, bruised purple. The city was stirring. Early workers on the docks. They hid in an alley, using their last bit of clean water for Catherine to wash her face and hands. She had to look like a respectable widow, not a fugitive. The steamboat office was already open, its windows glowing. A clerk sat inside. "I'll do the talking," Samuel whispered. She's too distraught to speak. Grieving. But Catherine shook her head. "No, I will." My mother's voice. Her arrogance. "It's the one useful thing she ever gave me. They expect a white woman to be in charge. I will be in charge." She took a deep breath and walked inside. "Good morning," the clerk said, his eyes barely lifting from his ledger. "How may I assist you?" Catherine placed the forged documents and a stack of money on the desk. Her hand was steady. She was channeling Lucinda. "I require passage to Louisville. On your earliest departure. A private cabin for myself and quarters for my property." Her voice was cold, imperious. The clerk finally looked up, surprised by her tone. He glanced at the 3 men standing behind her. Heads bowed, playing their roles perfectly. He examined the papers. He checked the seals. He held them up to the light. Catherine's heart was hammering so loudly, she was sure he could hear it. It felt like an hour. He stamped the papers. "The Morning Star departs at 8 a.m., madam. I can arrange that. Welcome aboard, Mrs. Kellerman." They had done it. They walked out of the office. Onto the docks. The Morning Star, a massive, beautiful, white steamboat, was right there. Freedom, it was right there. But as they walked toward the gangplank, Samuel touched her arm, gently. "Miss Catherine, don't look now." "But we are being watched." She couldn't help it. She glanced. A man, standing near a warehouse, dressed like a river worker. But his eyes, they were fixed on them, on Samuel. As their eyes met, the man turned and began to run, not toward them, but toward the main street, toward the sheriff's office. "He recognized me," Samuel breathed, his voice tight with panic. "From the auction or somewhere. He's a catcher, a slave catcher. We have to board. Now," Joshua said. They didn't run. Running would draw attention. They walked, fast up the gangplank. The captain, an older man with a weathered face, barely glanced at their tickets. "Mrs. Kellerman, cabin 4A, the others. Go to the cargo hold." "No," Catherine said, her voice sharp. "My valet. He stays with me. The other two can go. The captain raised an eyebrow, but he was busy. He waved them on. Fine, just out of the way. They found the cabin. Small, but it had a porthole. They locked the door. Joshua, Samuel, Daniel, and Catherine crammed inside, waiting. How long? Catherine whispered. The rider. He's going to the plantation, Joshua said. It's 15 miles, an hour, maybe more. He'll get your mother. They'll come back. We have maybe 90 minutes. The boat leaves at 8 now. They watched through the porthole. 7 a.m. Cargo was being loaded. 7:30 a.m. More passengers boarded. 7:45 a.m. The boat's whistle blew. A warning. They were so close. And then they heard it. Shouting. On the docks. Catherine looked. Her blood turned to ice. A carriage. Driving recklessly onto the pier. And behind it, 3 men on horseback. The county sheriff and her, Lucinda Kellerman. She descended from the carriage. Her face a mask of cold, controlled fury. Stop this boat. Lucinda's voice cut through the morning air. She was marching toward the captain, holding a piece of paper. The sheriff at her side. Captain, she commanded. You have stowaways. That woman is my daughter. And she is traveling with stolen property. The captain stopped. The gangplank was still down. Catherine heard the footsteps on the deck. Heavy, urgent. The cabin door burst open. Lucinda stood there. Her eyes found Catherine's. Did you really believe you could escape me? Behind her stood the sheriff, his gun drawn. Ma'am, he said, his voice uncomfortable. If you'll just come with us. But Catherine stood up. She was no longer the girl in the barn. She was holding her father's will. No, she said. I will not. You will leave. This is my property. You are a thief. She held up the will. This is my father's true will. You forged his signature. You stole this plantation. You murdered those girls. Lucinda's face, for the first time, changed. Not remorse, fear. She had been exposed. She is insane, Lucinda hissed. Hysterical. Sheriff, arrest her. And them. It's true, Samuel said, stepping forward. We sent copies, weeks ago, to lawyers in Philadelphia, to abolitionist newspapers in Boston. The real documents, they're already there. The truth is, already out. It was a lie. A beautiful, desperate, brilliant lie. They hadn't sent anything. Not yet, but Lucinda didn't know that. And the sheriff, he hesitated. A county sheriff, against a wealthy plantation owner. Easy, but against northern lawyers? Federal investigators? Newspapers? His courage vanished. Mrs. Kellerman, the sheriff said, turning to Lucinda. If there's an investigation from out of state, I can't get involved in a property dispute. It is not a dispute, Lucinda screamed. It is theft! But the captain had heard enough. He had a schedule, and he did not want a federal scandal or a potential murder investigation happening on his boat. Sheriff, the captain barked. Get off my boat now. This is a family matter. Settle it on land. He shoved the sheriff and a sputtering Lucinda back onto the gangplank. Pull it up, he roared. The Morning Star's massive paddle wheel began to turn. The boat lurched. Catherine ran to the railing. Lucinda stood on the dock, her perfect composure gone. She was screaming, a raw animal sound of pure rage. Her mask had finally cracked. The boat pulled away, heading north. They were free, but as they watched the Kellerman estate disappear, they heard it, a distant boom, and saw, rising over the trees, a column of thick black smoke. From the riverfront, Marcus, Elias, Silas, they had kept their promise. The story of Lucinda Kellerman ended there. The story of Catherine was just beginning. Samuel's lie became the truth. As soon as they reached Ohio, a free state, Catherine and Samuel did send the documents. They sent her father's will, his letters, and Catherine's own detailed, horrifying testimony to those lawyers in Philadelphia. The investigation that followed tore Natchez society apart. Lucinda was arrested. The conspiracy of silence broke. Other families, terrified of exposure, turned on her. They claimed she had misled them. The rehabilitation barns were uncovered, and in the earth, beneath the barn at the Ashworth estate, and the Cartwright place, and the Singleton barn. They found them. The bodies, Rebecca, Emma, Sarah, Margaret, 7 girls. Resolved. Lucinda was convicted of murder, forgery, and theft. She died in the state prison 2 years later, her name erased. Catherine, with Joshua and Daniel at her side, used her father's will to do exactly what he had intended. She freed everyone. The Kellerman plantation was broken apart, sold off. She gave Daniel and Samuel the education they had been denied. And Joshua, he stayed with her. They built a new life in the north, a life haunted by what they had endured. This story was never just about one woman or one barn. It was a glimpse into the darkness that happens when human beings are treated as objects, when appearance becomes more valuable than life, when a system, a society, agrees to look the other way, rather than face the monsters living right next door. The greatest horrors are not supernatural. They are human. They are the cold, methodical, psychological cruelties we inflict on each other in the name of order, tradition, and perfection. But what do you think? Was justice truly served? What about Elias, Marcus, and Silas? Their fate was never recorded. They were, like the girls, simply erased. Leave your thoughts below. And if you believe that history's darkest secrets must be brought into the light, subscribe to The Sealed Room. Click that bell, because the truth is always waiting to be found. And sometimes, history's darkest secrets are not buried in the past. They're still walking among us.